All right. Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm joined by Michael and Marini, my co-hosts. I will be introducing Liz today. Liz is a designer, urbanist, and spatial justice activist. Liz is a global expert on engaging and transforming unjust urban environments, from designing shelters for immigrant day laborers in the US to a water and health social enterprise for low-income Kenyans. Liz has a long history of working with communities in need to leverage the power of design to catalyze sustainable social impact. She is founder and principal of Studio O, a multidisciplinary design consultancy that works at the intersection of racial and spatial justice. In addition to her practice, Liz has held academic appointments at several institutions, including at UC Berkeley, Stanford's D School, and the University of Virginia. She also previously served as the Droga Architect in Residence in Australia, investigating urban marginalized populations and community development practices in the country. Liz has written for and been profiled in publications such as the New York Times, Bloomberg, which is formerly The Atlantic, City Lab, and the Journal of Urban Design. Her projects have been featured in museum exhibitions, received numerous design awards globally. Her honors include IDEO.org Global Fellow, TED Women Speaker, Aspen Ideas Scholar, Senior Fellow of the Design Futures Council, and one of Public Interest Design's Top 100. She earned architecture degrees from Wellesley College and Harvard University. So without further ado, welcome Liz.
Thank you so much. It's a real great pleasure to be with you. Sorry it's virtually and not in person, but it's been a year, so I guess we should be used to it at this point. But thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit about my work. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if that works. So just a note about me, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and just some of the things that I'm thinking right now. And I would say that I really think of this almost like a little bit of an invitation to a conversation. I'm definitely not presenting anything that's like a solution. It's very much more where I am in sort of thinking about all of these things, and hopefully we can have a really good conversation in the Q&A afterwards. And then I'd also say that although the title has apocalypse in it, which I admit is both tongue-in-cheek, but also quite serious. And as I get a little bit further into the talk, I'll explain a little bit more about that. But to get it started, I wanted to kind of start with a particular thread that has been of interest for me for a lot of the last several years. And that's really this idea of healing. So, you know, it's a word or a concept that feels a little bit weird to talk about in this time when, you know, I just was watching the news while I had lunch, and I'm based in Oakland, so lunch came later for me. But, you know, we just passed 500,000 deaths from COVID in this country. And so it seems a little bit weird to think about healing that's not specifically oriented towards that. And I would say that my conception of healing is not different than that. That's connected too. But I really mean healing as a much broader thing. Now, for me, healing is really spoken well by this comment by Dr. Kirkland Vaughn, who was talking in a way about some of the death that was happening with the pandemic, but really spoke much more broadly. You know, so one of the requirements for healing is mourning, and in order to mourn one's pain and suffering, the trauma itself has to be acknowledged. The trauma is not post, it is very current. And so, you know, it'd be easy to think about, you know, especially on a day like today, when we've crested this milestone, it could be easy to think about the idea of mourning all that we have experienced over the past year. What are we grieving? But I think it's also really interesting that there is another trauma that I think, I wouldn't say it's been revealed in this time, but I do think more people are becoming aware of it in this time. And that has a lot to do with what I think the Buddhist leader, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, so amazingly illustrated at the beginning of the pandemic when she said, the virus might not know boundaries or borders, but it knows how to follow the systems of injustice that are already in place. And so, you'll often hear some people talking about the twin pandemics, the pandemic of COVID, but also the pandemic of racism. And for me, when I think about this time, I think about it not only in terms of the intensity of what is happening right now, but how it actually is just making much more tangible and visceral things that have been happening for a really long time. And for me, this really comes at an intersection in the work that I do. And so what I wanted to expand on in terms of healing is how this plays out in the projects, in the things that I am thinking, and in particular in this concept of spatial justice. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it was coined by geographers some time ago. And it basically means that justice has a geography and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. In practice, what that means is that in countless cities across the country, we don't have spatial justice when it's possible to say that based on which neighborhood you're talking about, there are some neighborhoods that wind up with industrial uses and not the gleaming office towers, or some neighborhoods that wind up with the abandoned lots proliferating rather than nice parks. You could even do it with insufficient bus routes versus multi-million-dollar transit centers. All of these are examples about what the lack of spatial justice looks like. And the reality is that when we are talking about spatial injustice, we can't talk about injustice in space without also talking about injustice across race and class, because the truth of the matter is that Indigenous, Black, Brown, and poor communities have disproportionately had less access, and that has never been an accident. So for me, when I think about what this means, it's the understanding that as long as we are separated and selectively harmed by space, we will not heal any of the other wounds of injustice or create a more just society. So as I reflect on where we might go with this conversation, I want to note that how we hold healing in this moment, how do we talk about coming to a place of justice and universal collective justice, also has a lot to do with how we hold what time we are in. So earlier this summer, as I'm sure was the case with many of you, I was wrestling with the state of the world, from the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and a list that sadly goes on far too long, to a heavy burden being placed on low-income communities of color as we finally understood their work to be essential, to the high death toll of COVID in Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities. And in the midst of it, I was struck by how it feels like we've been here before. So we seem locked in a cycle where we only know two states of time, the time of urgency, or I would say emergency, and the time of complacency. In a time of urgency, we become overwhelmed by the awareness and scale of the problem or problems. We are eager for solutions that erase the pain of seeing and knowing. And I want to be clear that there's actually two types of urgency. You will probably often hear that quote, the fierce urgency of now, which actually often is actually focused on repair. And urgency, as it is most often used, I think, is actually more about forgetting. So in that urgency, when we feel like we have done enough to be able to forget the pain and discomfort of the moment, we move into a time of complacency. And that essentially is a return to normal, which for far too many is business as usual with a better Band-Aid. But here's the thing, to lean into any state of normal is to choose willful ignorance or to accept that the collateral harm is sad but inevitable. And I often just ask, how is that a satisfactory solution to any of us? So I want to hold that the path to healing can't be found if we're moving so fast and blindly in our urgency that we can't fully sit with the discomfort of what we and our systems have wrought, or so oblivious in our complacency that our discomfort becomes invisible to those with enough privilege to see past it. And so that brings me back to this whole apocalypse term. Now, when I've been using it this year, as I said, some of it's tongue in cheek, but some of it's quite serious. And when even in the serious time, I don't mean it in the sense of the sci-fi film that, you know, there's ton, and of which there are a plethora to describe this moment. But actually, I'm speaking about something that is connected to our past. So the word apocalypse actually comes from the Greek word that means an uncovering or an unveiling. Now, here in the Bay Area on a loaning land, which I'm based, it's been almost a year since we literally walked down. And for many, that announcement was cataclysmic. It ushered in a time when we struggled to find stable ground. But it's important to recognize that for many others, ground has long been uncertain. Millions living at the precipice of housing and food insecurity, neighborhoods of color having significantly greater vulnerability to poor health outcomes and early death, Black men and women, myself included, knowing that occupying public space safely is far from a universal right. None of these are new phenomena. What has changed is that the world suddenly got quiet enough for so many more of us to listen, to see, and to feel. We have all been allowed to really take stock of the power and the trauma of these systems that are working exactly as designed. Let me repeat that. The systems are working exactly as designed. So when I talk about healing and design, I'm talking about being just as intentional about acknowledging, reckoning, and healing the systems of harm in our built environment as we have been complicit in supporting its existence. For me, to hold healing as central to what I do is in particular about the concept of care. I don't just see myself as the designer. I understand that as someone who helps shape the built environment, then I am one of the caretakers of that environment. To be a caretaker means to have a responsibility to everything within it, to the many stories that are impacted by my actions. And to be accountable to that way of practice and being means that I be in relationship, deep relationship, with the communities that are the ultimate stewards of the places in which I work. So for the remainder of the talk, I want to show you what that looks like on the ground. One way in which I hold care is by remembering to never assume that a project starts at point zero, and instead making time and space to acknowledge the stories of harm and benefit that shape the context that I'm working in, such as here in this predominantly low-income Latino community in East Palo Alto. So this is a project that I've been working on for 4 years at this point. And East Palo Alto, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is is in a way an oasis of both ethnic power and poverty. It's perhaps the only place you could reliably afford to live in Silicon Valley if you worked as a cleaner at Facebook, whose campus is actually located on the edge of this city. It also came into being through the blood, sweat, and tears of middle-class African Americans who were redlined out of other parts of the county in the 1950s and 60s, which was actually detailed in a case study in Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. This has led to a situation in which the people of color run the local government, but that doesn't negate the extent of harm that generations of spatial injustice have wrought. And this is the case in this large-scale housing development where I'm working in that had previously been run by quasi-slumlords, and then actually was taken over a couple of years ago by the current owner, who is actually my client. And I should stop and say that, like, I'll use the word client liberally as I describe these projects, but it's important to understand that I believe I always serve two clients: the people who pay me and the people who are in this room, who are the ones who have to live with the impact of what I've created. And our system, when it comes to architecture and design, often privileges the person with the money. And I believe that my work, I believe that our work is actually about how do we create space and power for the folks that you see here on the screen to be able to actually also have influence, not just a sort of passive speak up at a community meeting influence, but like literal decision-making power and input into what happens on this land. And so here in East Palo Alto, at Woodland Park, which is the name of this property, it actually has over 1,800 units. And initially it was hired by the client to try and figure out ways to do community building because they recognized that they had kind of come in a bad situation. And so one of the things we did, the previous owners had effectively just broken all relations with the community. Lots of people were just angry, did not trust them. And so I'm notorious with my clients that I often refuse to hold community meetings at the beginning of the project. And this is often because I find that the typical meeting structure is often heavily transactional. And if we want to make change, and it's important to understand that when you're talking about making change, it doesn't matter if it's quote unquote good change, it's still change, it's triggering because it is different than what you have known. Even if what you know is bad, you sort of learn to set expectations around it. So someone saying that they're going to do something new, especially if you don't trust the person who says they're going to bring in something new, is often a recipe for being triggered and creating conflict because people are trying to protect their well-being. So for me, first and foremost, with any project, it's about how do we create relationships of trust. And so one of the things that we did in this project is that we just had a series of listening sessions with folks across the property. There were groups anywhere between 8 to 15 people. And we often kind of did it in this almost political party model. It's an old school model where you get one person who invites their friends or other sort of trusted neighbors, and we could either do it in someone's living room, or as the case here, there was a community room that we would use, and we'd provide dinner, and we'd have these small scale conversations. And I have to say that a lot of conversations, at least the early ones, there was a lot of yelling because nobody representing an owner had shown up for them in a very long time, and certainly not to listen to them. And so here we were saying that we're not starting this conversation with, look at this beautiful thing that we want to build for you. But instead, we really tried to convey that we were there to listen. We wanted to understand and know more about their lives and what they wanted us to know of this place. And we also, and I think this is important and connects back to this whole conversation of healing, we also very explicitly communicated that we were there to listen to the pain and to acknowledge that harm had been done. And I think this is really important. And I got some, my team and I, we got some blowback initially from the paying client who was like, but we didn't cause any of this. And I think it was really important that we say, it doesn't matter. We're the ones in positions of power now. So you have inherited the harm and it is your responsibility to address it. So what you see on this slide is a park that hadn't been conceived of prior to those conversations, but emerged explicitly from them when there was enough air for the expressions of pain to give way to the expressions of hope. So our side of, it's maybe helpful to describe a little bit more about the context of East Palo Alto in that, classic urban renewal move, the freeway that connected up to San Francisco, down through Silicon Valley. In the 60s, when they were extending it, they just built it right in the middle of this town. And so the town is split, and our side of town, which has these 1,800 units, does not have a park, does not have most of the services. They are all on the other side of town. So one of the things that we heard in conversations with people is that, we deal, a lot of our residents are low-wage workers. And so they're often doing shift work, and they were really concerned about the kids because they were often playing in the streets because there was no park. And so it wasn't like anyone ever explicitly asked for a park, but in hearing what they were really concerned about and what they desired, a place for their kids to be able to play safely, and also a place where they could be able to relax outside. Their jobs were stressful, their lives were stressful. They wanted a place of respite. So we worked with the property owner to identify a lot that was available, and we worked with the community to build a pop-up park. And so this is what you see. And I think it's really important to look at, it's not the provision of space that automatically solves and cures all things. We have to be willing to go deeper than that. So one of the things when people would often say to me, I want a place where I can be healthy and I can exercise. And I would often ask, do you exercise now? And many of them would say no. And it wasn't, and I didn't stop at that to assume that like, oh, the problem is a lack of space. And all I need to do is create a park and we'll fix it. But like in the spirit of having conversations and becoming friends with these folks, I probed more like, well, why don't you work out now? Do you go to the park that's on the other side of town, or the YMCA, or any of that stuff? And one of the things that came out was that the provision of space wasn't going to be enough. Like, people actually needed additional assistance to be able to exercise. So we reached out and formed a partnership with the YMCA that pre-COVID was coming in and offering classes in yoga, such as what you see on the right, Zumba. Both of those were highly oversubscribed. And they became really popular with the adults. There was also a walking club that got established. And one of the cool stories from this project is that, the property is so big, it's 1,800 units spread over, pretty much this side of town. And so it sort of has a delineation around a north side of the property and a south side of the property. And this park is on the north side. Some folks from the south side were coming to take advantage of using it for the kids to play, to be able to go to the courses. And then they started to complain because they were like, we want a park on our side too. And I was like, that's great. Like, you can totally ask for it. And so they put together a letter to the owner to petition to get a park on that side. And why I say that's great is I think that it's really important that, like, we think about the work that we're creating, not just in terms of outputs, which essentially is a park, but outcomes, which might be, children having, ability to play and be healthy, or adults having a space in which they can be healthy, or power being built and people feeling like they can ask for things, and that it's not a requirement of like waiting to see what little bit the owner decides to give them. So they submitted a letter, the owner agreed, we found another lot on the south side, and then about a year later opened up this park. Also a pop-up park that was done. It was actually a space that we were using for community building events. So we took this opportunity not only to create a park that would have like a bike and walking path and exercise space, but also would be able to work to create a much better event space. And so this picture that you see here on the right is actually an example of like it being used during one of our events. But like, the care was really setting up the opportunity to have these conversations that allowed us to see these places. And then these have actually also become seeds of understanding. There is a redevelopment project moving forward on one part of the property. And this has allowed us to test different things that may be possible to do as part of that redevelopment. I also hold care by remembering to shifting from a place of harm to one of healing does not occur overnight, or simply by creating something beautiful in the ground. It actually also requires, excuse me, moving from the transactions that too often define our systems of engagement. So, I talked in the Woodland Park example about that starting with this idea of listening sessions, but I think there's also something that's about like, how do we have an active state of reckoning that intersects with the design process? And so that's something that's been happening here in San Francisco on this site, which is, excuse me, the site of a former power plant in the historic working class African-American neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point. To put it in context for you, this neighborhood is another example of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. So in San Francisco, it has the highest concentration of public housing and industrial uses. And it's also worth noting that pre-pandemic, the median home price in San Francisco was $1 million, that's median. And the median income in this neighborhood was a little over $60,000. So this power plant was, yet another example of spatial injustice, the industrial uses. It existed for almost a century. And then in the late 90s, a group of mothers living in the public housing here on the hill above it led a community coalition to fight for its closure. They were successful. The utility company tore down the plant in 2008, cleaned the soil, capped it with asphalt so the clean soil wouldn't blow away. And so in some ways you could say, great, it's a success story. But the problem is that due to various issues like land entitlements, lease agreements, and zoning, is going to be, at the time, assumed to be upwards of a decade before anything could be done here. And we're actually at the decade mark now, and I think it's very likely that it's going to be another decade before something happens on the land. Unfortunately, what that meant is that when this was taken down and capped with asphalt, you wound up with 30 acres of asphalt. So to the utility company's credit, they realized that this was going to be untenable to leave the land vacant for that long. And so they actually sought out alternative uses that could happen in the interim. And I'm part of the team that won the commission to do that. So we've been partnering for, at this point, 7 or 8 years with groups in the community to do a bunch of different events, all geared around how can we turn this place that was forbidden in its previous life to a place that could be loved. And we really sought to have the community be the one to give us input about what kinds of events they wanted to see. And then we really saw our role as providing the land and the resources, but actually supporting the capacity of various organizations to be able to provide activities and resources that the community wanted to see. So that's everything from job training workshops to what you see in the middle. Is actually, there was an annual backpack giveaway that would happen on the site, bringing thousands of people from around the neighborhood, to even an annual circus that would, bring, again, thousands of people, something that's usually not seen within this neighborhood. And I would say that, the reigning feeling was like a place of joy, but also a place that was supposed to be for you. Now, in the time of COVID, on several of my projects, we've shifted to rapid response activities. So this site, I don't have a photo, unfortunately, of it here in this deck, but this site, we're now actually, we're on hiatus right now, but from April through January, we were giving 300 to 350 bags of food away weekly or biweekly. And now the site is being used for COVID testing, and hopefully when there's enough of the vaccine, we'll also be using it for that. And then beyond the activities themselves, it was really important that we could hop on what was the one permanent piece that was able to move forward. And so that was the shoreline, which still needed to be remediated. And the normal course of action would have been to take out the soil, put in, clean the land, put in the clean soil, and then, kind of maybe some like natural low maintenance plantings. And so we really worked with the company to say, how could we, restore this to a higher standard and create an amenity that ultimately could be given over with the land. And so essentially there was this shoreline park that was created, and all the decisions around the design were really dictated by the community. And one thing I should say, when you look at in the previous slide with all the different activities, in a way, they were actually our community meetings. So when I do decide to hold community meetings, I often try to vary what we think of as a community meeting. So the traditional community meeting, you have it in some like church hall, and it's usually held at an early stage in the process. You do a couple of them and then you don't talk to people again. To go back to what I was saying about the need to like create relationships of trust, that is not a recipe for a relationship of trust. What's more is that kind of setup actually rewards people who are time rich rather than time poor, which is often what I find in a lot of the communities that I'm working in, is that we actually have a lot of people who are time poor. And so instead of saying, come to this hall to talk about a project that may not see the light of day for a couple of years, you could come to the circus. And while, that's something you want to do with your kid. And while you're there, we'll ask you a few questions. And so we use that as an engagement activity for over a year to be able to get the data that allowed us to understand how to create spaces like this. one of the things that came up was people really felt that as the Bayview was gentrifying, that stories were being lost and nobody knew what had actually happened there. So all throughout this shoreline, there are actually interpretive signage cued around certain themes that tell the story of the community. And so in this particular one you're looking at, it's talking about the history of the plant, including the struggle that the community waged to close the plant. One of the things that we did early in the project was a series of StoryCorps recordings. It was a partnership. If you watch my TED Talk, I talk a little bit more about that. But we took quotes from those recordings and they're also embedded into the landscape. And so the idea is that these stories will never be lost, and that when people come here, even if you don't know this community that well, you're already sort of introduced to the stories of resilience and struggle that happened here. And I think that that idea of like, how do you tell these stories of resilience and struggle, but also how do you use them to have an ongoing conversation, is something that is like really important and goes back to what I was talking about in terms of how do you think about there being an interactive conversation with the design. So like the park, our events, they've all become beloved by the community, but for me, the true reckoning that this project is enabling is actually happening through these spaces that we're creating and the activities that we're creating that have the express goal of holding ongoing conversations about pain and resilience. And so what you see here is the booth that we built on site for that StoryCorps partnership. And this is one of those StoryCorps interviews that normally we ask people to come with partners, but whoever did it, I stepped in. And I think that's actually also another important point that I would say is I think sometimes there's a sense that like we hold ourselves as separate from the community, right? We're sort of consulting and we're behind the scenes and they see us for community meetings, but we don't really interact with them. And for me, the relationship building, I'm doing it in two ways. One is I'm directly building relationships because I need them to trust me. And I want to also be someone that they can trust. And then also trying to connect my clients, because at some point I do connect both clients, right? Because at some point I leave and it's really important that there's a relationship built. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next project. But I think here, just me stepping in, I can now go back to the community and people, if I'm gone or I'm not there, people are asking, well, where's Liz? And a lot of it is because they've come to trust my voice and then I'm out there looking out for them. And so they kind of want me always engaged in the process. Some other things that we've done around how do we like make this conversation around reckoning to be an active process is a partnership that we did during our 2019 year, which was a partnership with Chris Johnson, who's a local artist here in the Bay Area, but he was one of the creators of the Question Bridge Black Male project, which if you haven't seen it is a like super incredible project that's part of, there's a website for it, but it's part of the permanent collection of several museums around the world. It was a interactive video installation piece. You can see what we staged on our site. That basically they went around and interviewed hundreds of Black men throughout the US and then set it up as if they were in a conversation with one another. And the questions were often things having to do with identity and what it means to be them. And so we worked with Chris to stage it on our site, which was really great because there were actually several men from the Bayview who had been interviewed, but it had never been shown in this community. And actually that's Malik right there, who was one of the men from the Bayview and a local artist who we do a lot of work with. But also importantly, the idea of a question bridge, how do you use it to ask critical questions about a place? And so for the entire 2019 year, we essentially used it to ask questions about how do race and identity play a role in place, because we know that the Bayview is gentrifying and we wanted to create a way that people could use our space to have a conversation about that. And so here's an example of one of the contributions to that. And then finally, going back to this idea of care, I would say that I find care in expanding the design process to support opportunities for repair that look beyond the production of form like housing or a park. And so an example of where this is happening is in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I've been working for the past, at this point, 6 years on a project called Friendship Court. Now, when you hear of Charlottesville, you likely think of 2017 and the racist incursions that happened there. But the reality is that the wounds of racial injustice began long before then. So yes, this is a street that Heather Heyer was killed on. And I should note, we're just 2 blocks south there. I used to walk down the street to get from downtown to Friendship Court. But really, the history is much larger than that. So we're not located very far from UVA, University of Virginia. And when I first started working on the project, residents would tell me that they still refer to UVA as the plantation. So the wounds go much longer. Friendship Court was also created in part when renewal came to one as small as Charlottesville and happened to raise Vinegar Hill, which was the most prominent Black neighborhood in Charlottesville at the time, and created concentrated zones of racialized poverty, such as Friendship Court, which is a 100% Section 8 property, it's 150 households. And so for me, when we think about what does it mean to look at repair, there's an easy way that we could say that Friendship Court is over 40 years old. And so repair would look like giving them new housing. But the reality is you can't heal from this or this with just new housing. My paying client there, Sunshine Mathone, has this great line that he says that if all we do is build housing, we're just helping the poor to be poor better. And that doesn't sit right with any of us as what our aspiration should be. And it definitely doesn't feel like we are doing justice to the community when we do that. So instead, we've been really charting a path that's looking at how do we do active dreaming and practicing of new ways to heal from the past and to move past the yoke of systemic oppression. So in a typical project, right, the thing that we would be focusing on is this, which, actually is a pretty good project. We've looked at a way to break down the super block, and actually create more of a neighborhood. We've looked at ways to do a mix of housing and even wind up with a extra parcel, and to do so in a way that we're going to be doing it in phases so nobody gets displaced during construction. But as I said, that's not enough. So from the beginning, we've been exploring different ways to do this in a different way. One of the things that we did is we actually created an advisory board that was made up of residents and community members, and they've effectively been co-powered as decision makers in this process. We also have been steadily moving towards this idea of what would an anti-racist housing model look like. And that, prior to even the events of this past summer, it had been something that we've been talking about, but has taken even renewed urgency now. And as part of that, we've been looking at, well, what are the different things besides this that we need to be engaged in to say that through the investment that we're making here, the community is going to wind up in a better place than when we started. And so that's everything from examining generational wealth. So we're really looking at could we create a community land trust that all of the residents have shares in? Also looking at home ownership. So when we realized that we were going to wind up with this extra parcel, looking at as a potential slate for that. Financial Opportunity Center. So a way to actually look at how do we leverage investments to start to do things that might increase people's incomes. Healing and well-being, so everything from literal health to also understanding there is a whole trauma component that comes with sort of the lives, just getting by in our world, but also with systems that are actually really set about keeping people poor. So what does that mean? looking at intentional community building. So we know through redevelopment, we're going from 150 households to 450 households. That will be a mix of incomes. So like actually understanding that, most of the new people who will be coming in, it won't be at Section 8, they'll be coming in at higher income levels and higher rent levels. And so instead of just saying that like, oh, through co-location, this will be a great community, actually looking at, well, what does that mean in terms of intentional community building and placekeeping? And then how do we always keep resident decision-making at the heart of what happens in the future of this? And so as I have been trained, this is what I was taught to work on. But what I'm realizing is that if I'm talking about how I hold care for this community, all of this is the project. And so that means that my teams actually look incredibly diverse because we have different skill sets that are needed to support this. But I, as someone who's involved in design, need to figure out how do we design the systems of what we're delivering to be able to accommodate all of these things. So, I would say, in addition to that, it seems like it missed a slide. Oh, there we go. In addition to all of that, it's also about understanding that, like, at the end of the day, really, this is still all about the residents of Friendship Court. And so when I think about designing the system, it's still designing with a person at the center. It's always like, how's it going to benefit them? How am I leveraging the power and privilege and resources I have access to ensure that they can benefit from all of this, and that if it doesn't actually improve their lives, then I haven't done my job. So in this moment of revelation, I'm inviting you to lean into not forgetting that there is harm, and that for too long, our work as designers has done more to contribute to that harm than alleviate it. I'm inviting you to think about what justice means in your work and to actually act on it, and to also know that it's not just about space. It is, in fact, about working towards a collective justice, of which space is a critical part, and I would say too often is not at the table when it comes to talking about what repair might look like. And I think that really needs to change. I'm also inviting you to think about what it would mean if we all saw ourselves as healers and caretakers of the built environment, with a responsibility for and accountability to the care of everyone and everything within it. This is effectively the invitation. This is a conversation I think we should be having, and this is what you've seen is the work. Like, this is what I think we need to be doing. As I bring my comments to close, I want to share one last thought as I think about the nature of what it means to do this work. And it's based on this quote from the great abolitionist Miriam Kaba, who said that hope is a discipline. I would argue that these are disciplines too. And by that, I mean that the work of justice, healing, and care is not easy, nor is it fast, but I deeply believe that it is necessary. And so if you take anything from this talk, I hope you will move forward in coming to terms, your own terms, about what it means to be part of this necessary struggle. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions.
I have a question. So we're working on, my group is working on hidden racism in our Racism Uncovered class this semester. And I've found it very hard to even understand the community. I don't know if it's because I'm not there, or I haven't met them yet. But it just kind of puts a big sheet in front of my face as to what even someone would want out of that. So how do you come up with, I mean, I know you have met the people that you are building for, but what would you suggest we do to come up with the best design?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely really challenging right now in the times of COVID, because you can't just, normally I'd say, find community events and go to the events and mingle with folks. But I think, you know, some strategies given the times that we're in is that I would at least check out what are the organizations that are kind of active in that community, and just look and see, are they putting on any events? Are they doing anything to try and still keep community members engaged? Are there events that you can actually participate in? So say in the Bayview, there's actually a lot of stuff that is happening on Zoom. Not necessarily grabbing everybody, like we can have a whole other conversation about the digital divide, but it is a way to like be able to, they're open events, and there are ways to kind of see what people are talking about in the community. I would also look to see, has there been any attempt at like sort of oral histories or community blogs, things where in community members' voices, they're talking about what's happening. I think one of the challenges with right now is that a lot of community groups are heavily overtaxed. So I'm like hesitant to say, go track down a community group and talk to them, because I think like they need to be focused on serving their community, not talking to students, sadly. But you know, these you could basically use some secondhand research in this particular time as a way to try and understand from the community's voices what they're interested in right now.
Thank you.
Okay, I can read some questions from the Q&A from the audience, if you'd like.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so let me see. Okay, so Andrew said, oftentimes community outreach meetings result in the same types of suggestions that aren't specific. Can you speak specifically about the types of activities or engagement techniques you use to get unique suggestions / ideas from public stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to what I was saying about really focusing on the relationship building aspect of it. So like if my only engagement with folks is where I am putting up slides or boards, and like there's a pretty structured way in which people can give feedback, then all I'm going to get is things that respond to that version of feedback. And so part of what I do, you know, pre-COVID times was like going and actually chatting with people. I would remember people. I would have conversations that weren't just about like, tell me what I need to know so I can design this thing. I'd be like, so how are your kids doing? And, you know, where did you get that beautiful pin, right? Like I actually generally want to hear about their lives. I ask them things that I would ask my friends, right? Like, and I think, you know, we all, human beings are very smart. You know, we can tell when somebody's blowing smoke up our ass or who's just coming to us because they want something. Community members can do exactly that, right? And a lot of times in a lot of the communities we might find ourselves working in, they're used to people, or I could speak for the communities I often work in, they're used to like a whole slew. I'm just one in a whole long list of people who've come to say, oh, we've got ideas to design or improve your community. And they are often seeing that those things have not come to fruition as promised. So like part of it is also understanding I'm working a little bit in a trust deficit when I start, and that my job is like actually to build a relationship. So it's like, what are the questions you would ask to get to know somebody as a friend? Like those kinds of questions and conversations should be what you're doing. The other thing I would say is that I've also learned that people have different ways in which they believe in expressing themselves. So I offer different ways in which to give input. Sometimes it is like come in and do a post-it exercise. Sometimes it's an oral history thing of like communicate this or that, and tell me a story about something that I can record. I do stuff with kids. So like I might like say to the kids, come be an architect for a day and draw what you want to see here. I even had one project where we did a collage making workshop and I had them do tourism posters, because in what they said that they wanted their neighborhood to be known for, that gave me the information that I needed to know what to put into this place. So I sort of also understand that like I have to give multiple ways of allowing people to give input. And then that's often what will generate something past that really static answer that question was pointing to.
The next question is, do you have any suggestions for design firms who want to host listening sessions as you have done? How can we successfully implement similar programs in our own work? Do you recommend hiring professional facilitators?
So I think it is helpful if you have people who are familiar with the community, who are supporting the work, and maybe bridge builders to having the conversation. But I also think that, often when I'm going into a community for the first time, I don't necessarily know the people. And so I have to find who's going to be the intermediary to help support that conversation. So oftentimes one of my tricks that I do is I will identify who are the nonprofits who are serving the populations that I want to get at, and I'll do interviews with the nonprofit members first. And then once they get comfortable with me, I'll then ask, hey, can we do it with some of the folks that you serve and get their support to actually pull together focus groups. In the Woodland Park example, because it was already a property that had people, we were actually able to leverage the kind of sort of property management staff to get their support in actually bringing people together. And initially, we might have appeared at a couple of different events first and talked to people then, and just like sort of built a rapport with people and brought them in. I do recommend architecture firms doing it. And I would say, one of the things I've noticed, or sometimes I've had architecture firms say to me, where the heck do you squeeze this into the process, right? Like, it's pretty prescribed what we do. We go from concept design, schematic design, and design development. And I often say that, like, clients, meaning the paying clients, trust you to design the process, right? So if you say this is what's needed to actually get at the information, then like that has more pull. So you're not, in the Woodland Park project, for instance, the client, like, doing these listening sessions would not have been the way that that client wanted to go. Like, they were like, let's put on some community meetings and talk to them and communicate this. And we were like, nope, that's not going to work. Let us do this. And one of the things that we had to do because there was definitely a lot of grist in the beginning, is like, after every listening session, I always made sure to capture quotes, capture images, capture stories, right? And I presented that, and this is where, like, we're graphic people. You can present it in a really compelling way. And basically I saw that it was partly my job to bring these voices to that client so that they can see and that they could learn. And every time we had a listening session, there was something that came out that the client had no way of knowing, that helped prove the case of why they were important. So for instance, we heard very early on, there was a lot of tension with the security company. East Palo Alto back in the 90s was known as like the homicide capital of the country. That's another part of its history. So security is kind of an issue. It's much better now. But there's a security company, and one of the things that we heard complaints from people that like showed that this ownership did not care about them is that the security company did not have anyone on the ground who spoke Spanish. This is in a heavily Latino neighborhood. The client had no way of knowing that. And it wasn't until we were sitting in conversation at that intimate level that we could get at that piece of information that ended up leading to getting them changing security companies and hiring based on who had a really great ability to have bilingual staff and customer service, right? And then we were able to come back to community members who were like, oh, you listened to me. Something changed as a result of what I said. And so that's another thing that I would say, that if you embark on this idea of doing listening sessions, don't do it for the sake of having another engagement check. Do it because you're actually going to take the data that you learn from it and use it to actually change the design or change something about the process in a way that people can feel. Otherwise, to them, it's like we just said something, and as usual, those people came, took it all down, went back, and they didn't do anything with it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of connected to the next question. Someone wrote about that they're interested to know how you engage with system level change. For example, creating these spaces for communities is so important, but there are still systems of oppression in a place that keep these communities poor and undeserving. How do you work at the macro and micro level of change?
Yeah, so I think the Charlottesville project's a great example of that. You know, we are meeting monthly, sometimes multiple times a month with the advisory committee, and stuff is coming out of there that has, you know, is not anything to do with the bricks and mortar, but everything to do with like the fact that like the system is set up to keep people poor. So in looking at the project, you know, the original brief of the project was that we were going to do this new mixed income property. And then, you know, we might have the sort of general spaces that you have as part of that kind of development. But it was in talking to people and understanding what were some of the like key needs that they had, that certain features of the project have now come up. So the idea that, you know, half the population there is under the age of 18. And the kids at Friendship Court were starting multiple grade levels behind at the local elementary school. So as part of the development, we now have an early childhood center that's coming, that's going to be coming online as part of this and have fundraised for it, right? So that was like an example of understanding that larger systemic thing and using it to change the brief of what we understood that we needed to do. Or right now we're having conversations around community land trusts and and also about like how do we potentially set up a resident fund with an idea that, you know, when I did interviews with the resident members, one of the things that I heard from a lot of them is that where they saw their future was not at Friendship Court. And it was a lot of ways because they wanted a house. They wanted a place that they could leave to their kids so that the kids would not end up in the same places as where they are. So part of the idea with the land trust is like, how do we create something that actually starts to build wealth for people so that they could actually have a choice in what they're doing? And right now, like my week is crazy in part because we're submitting for a giant $10 million grant at the end of the week that's intended to fund some of these other things that are actually related to systemic forces that support keeping people poor. And so we're understanding that like the market has a really clear way to fund housing. It does not have a clear way to fund some of these other things. And so we're hustling wherever we can to basically plug money in. But part of my role is like understanding when we see those things popping up, how do we make sure that we're like designing around it? And I don't mean necessarily physical design, like it could be a design of a program, it could be a design of a strategy that like we're intentionally approaching this in a different way. And I think that's one thing I also want to encourage, that like part of holding space to look at these larger forces is thinking about, you know, I'll backtrack how I'm going to explain this. So I worked at IDEO.org, and Tim Brown, who was the founder of IDEO, once said to me that he loves architects because he thinks they're great systems thinkers. Through the process of like having to figure out how that little tiny detail might relate to that big old space, like we know how to move up and down and how to design at multiple levels. And so essentially I take that same thinking and I kind of apply it in my projects, right? So I know what it means when you present to me a plan and when we're working through what the design of that looks like, but I also know what it means when we're talking about like, well, how do we think about this strategy of housing and land ownership, and how do we design around that at that scale as well? And so all of it kind of becomes part of the project, which makes the projects more complicated, but I think also hopefully makes them more holistic and more geared around outcomes than outputs.
So there's another question from Carlos. He asked, do you think designers leave design school with a savior complex? Relationship building becomes difficult on a rotating semester cycle, so I wonder if we're being taught as a given that designers must save the community while skipping the trust building.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a loaded question. I may have said on, I gave a talk at NC State last week, and I basically said, you know, I was trained to be a white supremacist. And that's because like the underpinning, if you look, there's a great article that's, I'm gonna butcher the title of it, but it was a report that came out a couple of years ago and is getting a lot of play recently about what are the characteristics of white supremacy. Power hoarding was one of them. paternalism, another one of them, either or thinking, fear of conflict. If I were to look at project processes in the way that I'm taught, like all of those are embedded within it. And so I say it not as a thing to like go and bash all of us and make us all feel bad that this is hopeless, but more to kind of say that the underpinning of our profession is often about this very hierarchical approach to the world. And it sees being radical in terms of form and not in terms of like what we do with those forms in the environment and what we do with our processes. So if we operate as trained, yeah, we are taught to sort of like, we have an expertise. These communities, yes, they may be unhappy with certain things, but like they don't know what to do for design. And so therefore it's our job to like tell them or teach them. And so I think it's really important to walk away from that. And I don't want to discount expertise. Like I think that expertise is a thing, but I want us to be clear about what we are an expert in. Like, so I'm an expert in how forms come together. I'm an expert at looking at complicated things and figuring out how to synthesize it. I am not an expert in Bayview Hunters Point, right? I grew up across the bay from Bayview Hunters Point. I'm Black, as you can see, but that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in that community. And so I really had to understand like and approach people to sort of say, I have this expertise, you have this expertise. Can we come together and figure out how to do something here that supports you and delivers what you want to see for your community? And sometimes that does mean that I have to push back on something that they may ask for. And it's not, and I don't push back out of like, oh, I know better what you need. Oftentimes when I'm pushing back, it's either these are the constraints, budget, or like you're telling me you want this, but when I'm listening to everything else you're saying, I actually think this other thing might get at what you're trying to get at a little bit more. And then I ask them, is that right? And let's say 8 times out of 10, they'll say, yeah, actually, the way you phrased it, what you're thinking about, that actually totally works. For the 2 times that it doesn't, then I'm like, okay, well, let's work on this and figure it out. So I think it's partly assuming that there are stuff that you know, but there's stuff that they know too. And I think one of the challenges of design school often is because, and I get that there is you know, we're being taught to be good designers, like to understand form, but in the purity of not thinking about community or thinking about community in a super extracted way, the way in which we learn to design, we don't learn how to include those other voices and use it to enrich the design. And so I think that's a challenge that schools are going to have to wrestle with.
I had a like off-topic question, but you talked about like working with a very diverse team and like people that are, you know, experts at different things. For someone that is just entering the design world, how would you suggest that they find that diverse team?
That's a great question. You know, I think early in my career, I was just like a super nerd. Um, you know, if I could think of like, let's say public health, right? There's a lot of conversations about the intersection of public health and design. But oftentimes, at least when I was coming up, public health was not part of my design education. But there are lots of organizations who are talking about public health or who are having conferences or events about public health. So I just went and I tried to learn and like figure out what I didn't know and bug people and be like, hi, you said that thing, I don't understand. Can you explain? You know, and so it's like just basically you're kind of a student for your entire life, right? Even though you're not in university anymore. And so it's just approach it with that, like a curiosity to learn and to absorb. And what I found a lot of times was like, I was kind of like the first designer who had shown up in any of these conversations. And so they also had questions for me too. And so it's actually can work very well as an exchange. But yeah, I'm constantly poking my head in different things to be able to talk about them. So, it's a good example. A couple years ago, I'm still looking at this a little bit. I was super interested in the kind of hospice end of life space. And that was because I was really curious about this idea that, like, when something is at an ending and you have to let go so you can be able to move on, to me, that actually felt like it had a lot of analogies to things that I was seeing within the community process, right? Like that with change comes loss, and how do we support people to understand how to let things go? So I ended up like checking out a couple things online, and then found out that a friend knew a friend. And so I had a conversation with someone. Next thing I knew, I was presenting my thoughts at a conference about death. Now, not where I thought I was going to start, but like they were super interested in the way I was thinking about this. And so they wanted to like bring me in to support that conversation. So I think it's like, be open to talking, be open to exploring, and understand that like you may also have things to bring to this conversation as well.
Another question that I think kind of bounces off of that, how would you suggest one to get involved with the design companies that work towards positively affecting the community and environment?
Well, the plus side is that, like, unlike when I graduated from grad school like 15 or 16 years ago, there's a ton of groups that are now doing it. So I'm willing to guarantee there's one in, say, city, but in your state, there's definitely quite a few. And so I think some places that you can check out them, I mean, they're now also covered by like mainstream press. So I think, just looking up, or when you come across projects that look interesting. But I would also suggest groups like the Association for Community Design that, mostly started around community design centers, but has become a really great compendium for just conversations around this issue. Also, just ran a blank on, there was another conference I was about to say, and I totally ran a blank on that. But I think if you also, I'm not necessarily always a supporter of the like AIA, APA conferences, but I do think that they have been attempting to have conversations around this. And if you look at who are the groups that are presenting there, who's showing up there, those are folks that can be like kind of like-minded folks for you to be able to talk to.
Okay, so the next person, Violet, she says that she's currently part of a community-based group in Maine that is trying to close the last youth prison in the state, and that she says the long-term goal is to redevelop the grounds and facilities into community spaces as we vision for redeveloping the space. Do you have any suggestions of things to keep in mind?
Oh, that's such a loaded question. I think that given its current use, that there's likely to be a lot of trauma that is affiliated with that site. And so I think that one of the things that I would say is a starting point is like, how do you have a like conversation and a more explicit acknowledgement of what that trauma is and how people have related to that site, whose stories in terms of experiences are embedded within that land. And I feel like surfacing that has to be a precondition to then talking about, well, what do we do here? Because I think it needs to be held in some way. I think I would also think about, who your stakeholders are. So it would seem to me that it's probably partly the community neighborhood surrounding the site, but it also might be some folks whose lives intersected with it. And then I would also suggest checking out Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, which is actually also based here in Oakland. they explicitly are about restorative justice design, specifically focused on ending the carceral state. And they have done a lot of great projects that are looking at what happens in the aftermath of prisons. And so they just put out a proposal a couple months ago about the Atlanta Juvenile Detention Center. They did a study and stuff like that. So it'd be worth checking out their website. And their founder, Deanna Van Buren, has an amazing TED Talk called What a World Without Prisons Would Look Like. So you can probably also get some ideas out of that. Marcia, do you want me to answer your question or one of your questions? You're on mute.
Thank you. There's still, I think there are another 3 questions. Do you mind hanging in there a few more minutes?
Yep, that's
okay.
fine.
So from Marwan, how do you make sure that marginalized voices, meaning women, old, trans, etc., within the community have access to you or are taken into consideration?
It's a good question. So generally at the start of every project, I ask the question of who's been most impacted by the harm of whatever condition we are looking at. And therefore, like, who needs to benefit the most, or who we have the most work to make sure that they benefit from whatever we create. And so that usually surfaces like who some of these marginalized voices are. And then the next process becomes figuring out, so how do we get access to them? How do we make sure that they're included in the process? And then, and there could be a variety of ways to do that. Some of it is looking at who else in the community has access to them and using that as perhaps an entry point. And then also looking at like what have been their barriers for accessing engagement in any of these issues. And so it almost becomes a design problem then to understand, like, how do we design away those barriers? Like, how do we create a bridge that their access is actually supported? And then I usually, do some sort of tracking with either quantitative, qualitative combination of metrics to just make sure that we're keeping ourselves honest in engaging them. So I think it's important to have a conversation early on once you identify who you need to make sure to reach, that you also talk about how are you keeping yourself accountable to that. And then when are you checking in to make sure whether or not you're being accountable. And then when you find a moment where like, oops, we did not get, those people did not come, then you have to like then sit down and sort of ask, well, what can we do to actually get around that? So, an early in the Hunters Point project, we had set up the partnership with StoryCorps. We hadn't done any of the recordings yet, but we were going to do a listening party, which was something that StoryCorps does. And we had all of 7 people show up for that meeting, which was not a success story, right? And definitely not the people who, we really wanted to get folks who had been involved in the closure of the plant or whose voices had not been heard in talking about what needed to be done. And so that was a clear failure moment. And we had to sit with that and sort of ask, what didn't we do? Because in our heads, we were doing all the right steps for community engagement, but clearly it did not work. And so we then had to completely rejigger our plan and figure out, okay, who are the point people who have been successful in getting to those populations, and how can we talk to them and learn from their process or bring them into the team so that we can leverage their network as well, but they can bring that knowledge in. And so then fast forward to, we did another listening party on the other side of doing the recordings, and we had about 75 people who showed up. So, it really showed that we had been doing our work and having these conversations.
There's another question. It says, if a community wants something that you as a trained professional sees that will be detrimental in the future, but they continue to insist, is it more valuable to make the community happy or to make a more educated choice for them?
Love these loaded questions. So that goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier. Like usually if they're insisting, there's something there, right? I think it's really important not to take what is first said as like, okay, great, I'm gonna go off and do that. I always, pre-COVID, I do projects not only US, but also internationally. And I often, in the international ones, will be in places where I don't actually know the language and I have to work with a translator. But the one word I learn in every question, in every language is why. So if somebody tells me something, I just, there's Swahili, Kwanini, like why? Because I need to get at the root of what is driving this desire. And then once I understand that root, it might be that it actually has nothing to do with what they're saying, right? I mean, it does, but it's like, it's not actually about that, it's about this. And so then I'm like, okay, we can work to design around this. And so I think it's really important to go through that process of like getting at the heart of what it is that they're asking. And the fact that they're insisting is data. So it's not something to be discounted. It's like, well, why is this so important to them? And I think if you follow that thread, you'll get at something that helps you understand both why they are insisting, but also where the thing you're suggesting actually may not be the right thing, or it needs to be recalibrated to actually literally meet what their needs and desires are, which may not be what they're asking for, but someplace that's in the middle.
So I think we don't want to keep you much longer, and I trust you'll come back sometime and answer some of the many questions that we didn't have time for. But on behalf of the School of Interior Design, we really appreciate hearing from you. And I think we probably had more participants in this college lecture than maybe in the ones previous. So that's a really great thing. That means you got your word out, which is terrific. So, and thanks all of the students from Interior Design for hosting this, and for Nick, and to everyone who participated. Liz, I hope to talk to you again really soon.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.